Bueno, vamos a empezar entonces nuestro taller. Ya tenemos un buen número de participantes. Buenos días para todos y para todas. Mi nombre es Isabel Mancera. Yo hago parte de la innovación. Les doy la bienvenida a todos al taller virtual Avanzando hacia un futuro circular. Eh, la idea es que para nosotros es un gusto contar con espacios como estos. Desde el Lab hemos venido trabajando para aportar a la transición de la economía circular en diferentes sectores y es un placer contar con entidades como Circle Economy. Es una entidad líder a nivel mundial en la implementación de la economía circular y hoy nos brindarán herramientas y experiencias aplicables que esperamos que puedan ser de mucha utilidad para todos ustedes. La idea es que el cambio que buscamos requiere una colaboración radical, no solo para comprender cómo podemos cambiar de rumbo, sino también para asegurarnos de que estamos comprendiendo bien los cuellos de botella para las organizaciones que buscan migrar o implementar la economía circular. Entonces, como socios en esta transición y también en conjunto con Circular Economy, la idea es que queremos aportar a todo esto. Muchas veces se necesita tener a las personas adecuadas en la misma mesa y la idea es poder generar este diálogo el día de hoy en este taller. Esperamos que tengan todo el provecho de la información que el día de hoy brinden. Están disponibles todas las preguntas y la interacción que queremos realizar el día de hoy. Voy a dar unas recomendaciones para el taller. La idea es contar con la cámara encendida. Habrá disponibilidad de una traducción simultánea. El Zoom tiene una opción abajo que es un icono de un mundo que se llama interpretación. Allí van a encontrar si quieren elegir inglés en su idioma original o español para la traducción durante todo el taller. La idea es que por favor todos mantengan el micrófono en silencio, sobre todo en la sesión de plenaria, y por favor desactiven cualquier tipo de aplicación que pueda generar distracción y sobre todo sonidos durante el taller. De nuevo, bueno, todos recibieron la información de descargar la aplicación de Miro. La idea es que vamos a utilizar esta herramienta durante una parte del taller en un ejercicio que vamos a tener en conjunto. Y nada, le doy entonces la apertura al taller y la palabra a los compañeros de Circle Economy para que inicien todo el proceso. La idea es que levanten la mano en los momentos que requieran que tengan alguna pregunta o que requieran algún tipo de participación. Allí también está la opción de levantar la mano. Van a estar dos personas atentas a todo lo que se requiera en términos técnicos durante el taller. Entonces, de nuevo, muchas gracias por estar con nosotros el día de hoy y le doy la palabra entonces a los compañeros de Circle Economy para que introduzcan y empiecen con la presentación. Gracias.
Thank you, Isabel. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We are very, very excited to join you on your circular economy journey. So first, to give an image of who we are or who is joining you today, we're actually with four. Ivana is not on this slide, but we're with Mariana, me, Kinge, and Kaspar, joining from Circle Economy, and we'll very briefly introduce ourselves so you know who we are. As I said, my name is Kinge. I work in the design and brands team, so I focus within circular economy on design and innovation mainly. And Mariana, do you want to briefly introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Mariana. I work at Circle Economy on our digital products and on the information system that supports our research and our digital products.
And then I will continue. My name is Casper. I work as a business strategist with Circular Economy and mostly focus on analyzing business systems of material and energy flows, and also every now and then get to do so on national level systems.
Thanks.
Yeah, very happy to be here today.
Ivana, do you quickly want to say hi as well, even though you're not on this slide?
Yes, hello, my name is Ivana. I'm also part of the design and brands team, and I will be here to help more on a technical level.
Yes, and Ivana is Colombian, so you can speak Spanish with her. Our Spanish is not so good, unfortunately. All right, so to tell you a little bit about Circle Economy, we're an impact organization based in Amsterdam, focused on accelerating the transition towards a circular economy by focusing mainly on the practical and scalable side of solutions. We're with around 45 people in Amsterdam, started in 2012. And our main work is we work mainly together with businesses and cities. And we do that into different expertise areas. So as you can see here, we work with cities on finance related topics, textiles as well, design and brands. So our expertise is really across a variety of themes. One that we'll dive deeper into today is also the data part. So an example of what we quite often do is, for example, city scans, where through 4 phases we'll define how material flows go through a city and what strategies are to create an action plan to become circular. So as an example of what we do as circular economy, but what are we going to do today? So first of all, we're going to discover what the circular economy is. We'll have a look at best practices, at case studies, and then the main bit of this session will be exploring what circular data and metrics are. And we're going to do that hopefully as interactive as possible, also via Miro, a program that we'll be using and that I'll introduce to you very shortly in a bit. So as mentioned, we'll have an introduction to circular economy where we'll go into an exercise. Then at 10:25, we'll have a little break, a 10-minute break. 10:35, we'll start looking at impact and measurement, have a little exercise with that as well. We'll dive into data and have an exercise there. And then we'll wrap it up, and we are thinking to be done at 12:15 your time. So the online workshops are, well, quite different from having a workshop offline where you can all see each other. So we've written down a few guidelines to have for the online workshop. So it's quite high-paced, high energy, so we'll be quite strict on timekeeping. If you get cut off in a workshop, in a breakout group, write half on your sentence. Don't take it personally. It's just for the sake of timekeeping. If you lose energy or focus, let us know. We can always throw in an energizer. And if you have any questions or comments, do throw them in the chat box. We can see the questions. We'll also keep track of them. So let us know if you have any questions. Then if something happens, if your connection fails, you drop out. I've wrote down here, reach out to Santiago, but I think it's Isabel that people need to reach out to if something happens. But we're in close contact, so we'll get you back in. And other than that, it's still an ideation workshop. We have an ideation and exploration mindset, so only good ideas and good questions and good comments exist. All right, so I want to start with a little check-in. And with that check-in, we're also gonna explore Miro, the interactive tool that we will be using today. So Ivana, could you share the link from Miro over the chat box so that we can all open Miro? So this is an interactive tool that we use for the workshops. Let's see. So we've asked you before to create an account here. You don't need to create an account. You can also just go to the workshop and to the Miro board and join as a guest. But if you create an account, we know who you are, and it's nicer, it's better in collaboration. So if you can open the link that Ivana has sent, there is a password, Circle Economy. And then move over to the energizer part. All right, I see people coming in. That's great. So right down below the finger pointing down, we have the energizer, the introduction. And it's really for us to get an understanding of how Miro works, to get you all familiar with the functions of Miro, so we'll be equipped to use it later on. And let us know if you have any questions about it. You can post them in the chat box. All right. As more and more people come in, I'm going to start explaining the first exercise. It's a bit of a game. So we're going to look at how to drag things across the screen by answering the question, how are you feeling about the opportunity to learn and apply the circular economy? So what I want to ask from you is pick an emoji out of the list. You can press on it and then drag it to the quadrants according to how you feel today and how excited you are about the workshop. Great, I see many of you moving around already. Good to see it's working. We have a rocket and a dancer, little sun. I wish we had sun here. Where I am, it's already dark. Great. And the change in size, yeah. Do try out everything. You see on the left side, you see a toolbar. You see a T that allows you to write any text. Underneath the T, you can add a sticky note. All right, great. And if you're done with the emojis, you've managed the dragging part. Let's have a look at the second question today. This might be a difficult one already, but do describe how you think about it now. Feel free to write it down in Spanish. And the question is, how would you currently describe circularity? So use the post-its. You can double click on them and then you can write. And again, if you have any questions, do let us know via the chat box, or you can also speak up by unmuting yourself. I'm very happy to see that everybody is in the high energy, count me in side. Where do we write? Yes, so we write the answers down in the post-its. If you double click on the post-it, you can write down anything. If you can also choose on the toolbar on the left side, you have different options if you hover over it. So you have a T, which means text. You can just write down in text. Underneath, you have sticky notes, so you can choose whatever color you like to write down your answers on. All right. So for everybody that's new to Miro, have a look underneath the finger pointing downwards. That's our first trial of how to use Miro to get acquainted to the program. So have a look at, we have 2 steps here. So first try to drag an emoji into the quadrant to tell us how you feel about today and about the workshop. You can choose whatever emoji that reflects best how you feel. And next to that, we ask to write down on a post-it or in the text box how you would currently describe circularity. And I'm going to give you 2 more minutes for that. And then we're going to return to the main, to the next keynote. All right, it's great to see all of the arrows going through the screen. Let's see what we have. Planet Earth for the next 10,000 years, yes. Ecodiseño, yeah. Inclusive recycling and broad variety of answers. Yeah. All right. So I hope you all got a chance to get familiar with Miro. In the rest of the workshop today, we'll be using Miro for our exercises in the breakout groups. We'll mainly be using the tools that we've used now. So hopefully you're familiar and set for the rest of the workshop. I would like you to switch back to the Zoom meeting so that we can continue with the introduction to a circular economy. All right, so I hope you're all back now, and I will start. So today I'm going to explain circular economy to you in 2 steps, in 2 parts. First, the challenge of the circular economy, of the linear economy, and then the solution. So first, diving into the challenge. We're currently living in very exciting times. The possibilities of what we can do seem to be limitless. But whilst we do so, we've been stretching the boundaries of what nature and Earth can offer us. But what is the problem here, and why is this a problem? That's what I'll go through in the next few minutes. So at the heart of the circular economy lies the idea of moving away from the linear value chains that have been in place for more than 200 years. So since the beginning of industrial revolution around 200 years ago, our economic growth and prosperity has been made possible due to the extraction of resources. And as you can see in this figure, the white line shows the economic development since the 1900s. The line is nearly similar to the blue one, which shows the material extraction. In short, the challenge we're facing, and where circular economy gives us an opportunity, is to continue the white line for an ever-growing group of people to the economic development, but on the same hand, whilst lowering the blue line, lowering the material extraction. And the problem is really with that material extraction, because it's been really testing the boundaries of what our global ecosystem can handle. And a research institute, the Stockholm Resilience Institute, has defined 9 major planetary boundaries, which are crucial to life on Earth. And 3 of these boundaries we have already exceeded the capacity of the Earth, and for 2 others we're about to do so. And these include climate, biodiversity, and the atmosphere, the ozone layer. So we're putting a lot of pressure under the boundaries of the Earth. And as a result, the global ecosystem is losing a lot of its balance, and we risk losing life as we know it today. So a question could be, can it be reversed? And there is actually a really interesting example from the 1970s and 80s, where with the right action, and it also included legal action, a boundary can actually become better, or the stretch on the boundary can become better. And what happened is that the hole in the ozone layer increased mainly due to the use of CFCs, which are used in refrigerators. And the Montreal Agreement has banned the substances within that. And due to this ban, way less refrigerators were using CFCs. And with that, the ozone layer got actually a lot better. So I would say there is also hope. But if we continue to go and consume in the way that we're doing right now, we'll need 3 to 5 Earths to sustain us. So as I mentioned, at the rate that we're consuming right now, we would need a lot more Earth than we have. And how does that show? There are really visible signs of what we can see, what the stretches on the Earth has been. So an example is the Aral Lake in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. And 50 years ago, the Aral Lake extended 450 kilometers from southwest to northeast and was 290 kilometers wide. And Aral Lake was one of the 8 largest lakes in the world. And today, there's almost nothing of it left. And the drying up of the lake is considered to be, well, one of the greatest environmental disasters. And what has caused it to dry up is cotton production that started in the 1960s. And the main cause of this disaster is the irrigation for cotton cultivation, which has extracted a lot of water from the supplying rivers. The mass production of cotton demanded ever-lowering prices, and the prices of cotton plummeted, so that more had to be produced to make a profit of it. And that's how a vicious circle went on. What were the effects? The lake went from sweet to salty. There was agricultural poison in the water. Salt granulates were left to dry. Grains of salt contained poison, and they were spread again through the landscape as well. And the fishing had disappeared. But luckily, the awareness of the problem was raised, and the World Bank has allocated quite a big amount of money to improve the flow of the rivers, and it's already a bit better than it shows here on the picture. And this shows maybe for all of you an example that's a bit further away from home, but there are also many examples of climate change scenarios in Colombia happening. And as you can see on this picture, we've pointed out 4 different examples of things that happen locally. So as you can see on the left, damage caused by the coffee leaf miner could be critical on long periods of drought. There is also a lot of change in the weather, in the climate, which has a big impact on the quantity of water in the Andes region. But also the quality is really changing. Another example is rainfall. We've seen way more extreme weather conditions, and rainfall has concluded in a river overflow and also displacement of rivers. And as 4th one, fires. A lot of wildfires have happened due to a temperature rise, and the temperature rise has a conclusion that it dries the vegetation, and that is really a sparkle for a fire to start. So I think there are too many examples of the changing climate, and the urgency is actually very clear to do something. And that's only from an ecological perspective. There is also an economical risk in keep doing business the way we have been doing so far. As you can see here, scarcity of raw materials can have an impact on the pricing of the materials and availability of it, and also for the products that you make from it. The material costs can increase, and that's all based on the unpredictability of the climate. But there is also the reputation risk. And to give an example, Shell no longer wants to speak of itself as an oil company, but as an energy provider. And that's really because the polluting nature of an oil company plays a really big role in the public perception. So they've already changed how they phrase it, how they talk about themselves. So let's continue to the solution. The circular economy is not something new. I won't go into details of all these books, but Walter Stahel mentioned it in 1976. It's the Club of Rome that has mentioned it a long time ago. It has taken some time to gain traction and to gain the awareness that it has right now. But it's really built on great work that has been going on for quite a long time. And the circular economy builds on the idea that the linear economy follows a current take, make, waste model, where we take raw materials, make them into products that we need or sometimes not need. And when they're not used anymore, they get sent off to landfill. Products are made without thinking about what happens when such a product is no longer used. And sometimes even worse, products can be made with knowledge that they break in time so that consumers have to buy new products. That's called planned obsolescence. Yeah, I'll talk a bit slower. So the circular economy, as said here, offers a promising solution. What we want to work towards is an alternative economic system in which value is retained for as long as possible and there is no waste. The concept is based on systemic cycles in nature and therefore follows a systemic approach, which means, and we're just in the middle of the most exciting part, I think, of this keynote, and that's the model of the circular economy. I was talking about that the concept is based on the systemic cycles in nature and therefore follows a systemic approach, which means that it doesn't only look at one single element or one piece of the pie, but it really focuses on the entire pie and often going to a core of a business model, for example. So the circular economy can be seen as quite an abstract concept, a bit fuzzy, multifaceted. So at Circle Economy, we've done a research studying different organizations, 20 different organizations, their publications, their content, to understand what language they use to define the circular economy and how to aggregate it into a framework that is has a good overview of the circular economy. So this is the 7 key elements. It's an encompass of circular strategies that organizations can pursue. On the left side, you can see 3 light blue strategies. They are core to the circular economy. So prioritize regenerative resources, preserve and extend what's already made, and use waste as a resource. And then on the right side, you can see 4 of them that are a bit more darker blue, and those are enabling the circular economy. That means that if you use the strategies that fall under them, you have a better chance of making your offering circular. However, if you just look at rethink the business model, it doesn't guarantee your solution to be circular. To exemplify the 7 key elements a bit more into detail, we're going to go into some case studies. And we're going to start off with HP. So HP has considerable manufacturing operations in Brazil and have set themselves a zero waste to landfill ambition through circular economy strategies. And to help achieve this, HP has formed a partnership with Synctronics, and they have facilitated development of processes to increase the volume of recycled materials in new products and packaging. So they use recycled products, recycled materials in their new products to make sure that they use resources and not raw materials as well. Where were we? At the 7 key elements. So hopefully you've had some time to look at the 7 key elements and see what they are at. I started talking about HP and how they use waste as a resource. So they have recycled raw materials in their new products. I'm going to continue with prioritize regenerative resources. And here you can see a collaboration between two brands, Danimer Scientific and PepsiCo. And they have a bio-based and compostable snack bag using resins that are blends of lines of biopolymers and mineral fillers. And what that means is that they are using biomaterials for their packaging, which are better handled after use than technical materials, which have basically need to be recycled, and these can be composted off. So that's a lace in, and this is in Chile happening. I haven't heard of this happening in Colombia as of yet. And then we go to the third core element of the circular economy, which is stretch the lifetime, focusing on maximizing lifetime of something that's already in use. And you can do that through maintaining, upgrading, repairing. And what we show here is Patagonia and their Worn Wear campaign. And they allow you to repair clothes, and they'll drive around in a van at local places, but they're expanding now as well also to shops. So really what they offer their customers is to have their clothes repaired, so that when something breaks, they don't necessarily have to buy something new, but they can still use their same garments and prolong the life in that way. And that's an example from the textiles industry, but we also have an example from Philips. So that's Capital Equipment. And they have a location in the Netherlands, in Best, where they remanufacture their products, their MRIs, to extend their lifetimes. And it opens up a complete new refurbishment market for them. So while resources are in use, maintain, repair, upgrade them to maximize the lifetime and give them a second life through take-back strategies when applicable. So that's Philips and stretch the lifetime. So those are the, and here's another example of preserve and extend what's already been made, and something that we see popping up more and more. And those are local centers in local communities, repair centers that allow citizens to repair their computers, all their electronics, their phones, because quite often when a computer breaks or when a phone breaks, it actually can be repaired. And within these local communities, they help individuals to repair what they already have, so they don't have to buy anything new. So let's continue with design for the future. And design for the future is really focusing on looking at products, how they are created from the beginning, and making sure that from the beginning onwards, they're made in a way that that is circular and is conscious of material use. So this is Fairphone. It's a modular design smartphone. It's a company based in Amsterdam. And because of its modularity, the lifespan of the phone doesn't depend on breakdown of any part of the product. And in this way, you don't have to buy a completely new phone when, for example, your battery stops working or when the camera doesn't work anymore. The different parts can be replaced independently. And for design for the future, we also have another example, and that's Notpla. They have created, so their design challenge really was, how can we make a packaging that is non-technical and that can be either recycled or disappears when using it. And what they've created is a packaging out of seaweed. It started with only packaging of water. So what it is, it's sort of a pouch, and you can just put it in your mouth and it dissolves. So you don't need any packaging around that anymore at all. And really interesting, they've implemented it during the London Marathon, where there was this issue during marathons that a lot of people got a cup of water or a bottle of water, which resulted in a lot of waste on the sidewalks of the marathon. But by using this, they could they just eat their water in a way, and they didn't have waste anymore. So next to the next digital element, implement digital technologies. So you may be familiar with the e-coins. It's a program that was launched in Peru. It's a virtual currency that offers consumers discounts for when they deliver waste. So the program aims to foster incentives to recycle through education campaigns that involve the consumers. So it's a really good example of how consumers get involved in the process as well. And they use digital technology, a digital platform to incentivize the recycling. And then rethink the business model. So this is an example, this is called Mud Jeans, the company. They're a jeans company, as the name might say so. And their business model is renting out their jeans instead of people to just sell them. And in that way, users will have the ability to repair the jeans, to get a repair for their jeans, and they can swap for a new pair if they get broken. So after a year, they can continue leasing, or they can keep the jeans and wear them as long as they like, or they end their relationship. But in this way, Mud Jeans gets to keep the materials for themselves and make sure that there is no, at the end of life of the jeans, the materials can get recycled again. So they still have ownership of the materials that they use in their products. So that's the last example that we go through. And next to that, we have an exercise planned for you, which is called the circular brain game. It's in Miro, as we've practiced before. So what you will see is two examples on the board. They have an explanation to it. It's in English, but we've heard there will be translators in the groups as well. And the question here is, read through the examples of the brain game and then have a look at which ones of the 7 key elements link to these examples. So you can draw a line to the 7 key elements or make a text box, whatever you prefer in Miro. And then there is a second question, what can these brands do more to become circular? So we're going into 5 breakout groups. Me, Casper, and Mariana will be facilitating, but unfortunately we cannot split us 3 in 5. So if you have any questions, you can raise your hand. It's a function in Zoom, or come back to the main group. So then we'll be able to come to you to explain a bit more. Erika, are we ready to go to breakout rooms? I get a yes, okay. Okay, so we're gonna have 3 groups, which is great. So me, Casper, and Mariana will be able to be facilitating 1 group each. So we'll be there to answer all of your questions, but foremost, this is for you to discuss what the circular economy means for these case studies. All right, so you should have gotten a message that asks you to join the breakout room. Next up is our break. We have a 10 minutes break, and I can recommend you to stand up, go away from your screen for a little bit, walk around. Spending these hours in front of our computers is already quite intense, so really use this break to have a little walk. And then I'll see you back at 10:50, if I'm correct, in 10 minutes, 10:50.
Perfect. I think now we have the screen back. And is everyone back from their break now? So we can continue with the second part of the workshop. All right. Hope the translation is working as well. Otherwise, please let us know in the chat. But yeah, the next segment that we will be looking at in this workshop today is concerned with metrics and measurement of the circular economy. Okay, and we can listen well. That's great to hear. The role of metrics and measurement in transitioning to a circular economy. So a quick recap of what we just heard is we understand that the current linear economy is not really serving us well, and we need to move to a different model that can deliver a more ecologically safe and socially just economic system. And we've also learned that the solution for this is a circular economy, one that keeps products and materials in use for as long as possible, designs out waste, and regenerates the ecosystems that we depend on. So that sounds all great. So we should let's get started. But wait, it seems we're not quite there yet. We need more input. We have, at least on our end, a lot of questions still. So we want ecological safety, but how can we actually measure what constitutes ecological safety? And then how can we put quantified targets to this? And how can we then ultimately ensure that our solution, being the circular economy, actually contributes to this objective? And then how circular are we now? How far along are we? And how can we measure what the progress that we're making by applying these strategies that Kinga just presented? So the conclusion is we need metrics to guide our strategy for sustainability and a circular economy. And what we want to do in the coming few minutes is we want to guide you a bit through some of the key steps of setting up these key elements to a measurement framework for an impactful circular economy. And for that, we will also jump back into Miro again in a bit and walk you through a couple of exercises in the breakout rooms again. But for now, bear with us for a couple more minutes as we explain a bit more the concepts. Ivana, if you could go to the next slide. Yes. So before we can even start this entire process, what we need to know is what is even the subject which we're innovating on, which we're bringing a circular economy to. So where do we want to bring that impact? And there's two key questions that we want to ask ourselves in this process. And that is, what is the entity for which we currently want to set up circularity and impact metrics? So are we looking at an economy, such as Colombia as a whole, or a city or regional economy? Are we looking for a specific sector, for example, agriculture, or a specific value chain even of a specific product, a business itself and its operations, or, oh, I think now the screen went away. Yep, there it is again. A specific process as part of a value chain, an individual product, or even an individual material. And in the second part, the question, we want to understand at which level we're analyzing this, this entity, which is either, are we really looking at the global level, a national level, or even a regional level, or very local, locally defined analysis. So this is the first step that we need to do, or actually the step before we even get started, because the first step is then to understand for this subject that we want to innovate on, what are actually the impact goals that we want to achieve. And what is our main rationale for even wanting to go to a circular economy? And for that, it's important to remember that usually what we want to achieve with a circular economy is sustainability, sustainable development. So that's why here we show in a slightly different manner kind of the most agreed upon framework of what constitutes sustainable development, which is the Sustainable Development Goals as defined by the UN. These are 17 goals, and you could argue that for a circular economy, actually not all of them are equally relevant, or the circular economy can't deliver impact in equal amounts on all of them, but especially on those concerned with the biosphere. So at the bottom of this, this graph, there's a lot of value to be gained, as well as in the economic part of how we organize our economy and make sure that it is more sustainable and more resource efficient. And with that, I'm handing over to Mariana, actually.
Yes. So The Sustainable Development Goals also are underpinned by 169 targets. And those are the first metrics which help us guide into how we can get towards them. But the metrics themselves don't necessarily tell us about the type of data that we need to get to actually measure those targets. And it doesn't tell us how to get to that data. So as Casper mentioned, the main impacts that are associated with the circular economy are related to environmental impacts, but there are also some spin-offs into socio-economic impacts. And I wanted to discuss here that ecological data is very, very difficult to collect and has thus far not really been collected very well, as our economy has been structured largely around economic data. So we have a lot of monetary data and economic data, but not as much information about environmental data. Secondly, environmental data is just very difficult to capture in general. So if we think about something like biodiversity loss, that's conceptually very relevant, but very difficult to actually count the number of species and to keep track of which ones are being extinct and which ones are new species coming up. So in practice, very difficult. Similarly, something like climate change, which is a very well-known topic and measured by CO2 concentration, is measured across many research centers using various methodologies all around the world. And those results then have to be aggregated and put together over time, which is also just generally quite a challenging exercise. If we look at the socioeconomic data, even something like job creation, which is very, a straightforward concept, is very difficult to capture data on structurally and dynamically if we consider that most of this is collected via census and via surveys. And we actually, our labor force and our markets are changing very fast all the time. And we don't really know how to link number of jobs created directly to these interventions. So if you go to the next slide, I wanted to just discuss quickly that there are increasingly alternative methods of capturing this impact data. And big organizations are trying out a lot of very alternative and very interesting methods of capturing this. For instance, on the left, we have an example of land use change, where we can use satellite data over time to understand what's happening on the land. And on the right-hand side, we have another example, which is the use of satellite imagery of lighting at night to map out the access to energy. And this is a research methodology that combines the satellite data with information about roads and maps out energy grid lines. At the bottom, you can see, wait one second. These sorts of methods, as I said, are captured in research organizations. And I put some of them at the bottom over there. And they really just talk about different kind of like very big, high-level data sets that can be used and applied in these innovative ways towards measuring impact data. So yes, next slide.
Okay, do we have everyone back? Perfect. So then we're going to continue with the analysis and the next step, which is how can we link the impact goals for the subject that we've just defined to the circular economy? And how can then the circular economy actually help us to achieve that impact? And for that, if you go to the next slide, it is really helpful to trace how these socioeconomic or ecological impacts relate back to the flow of materials and energy. And we can do so at different levels. So what you can see here is actually the main visual of the circularity gap report that Circular Economy publishes for the global economy, where you can see materials flowing through the economy from left to right. So from the point of extraction in very just the basic resource categories of minerals, ores, fossil fuels, and biomass, and then flowing through the economy through different processing and production stages to ultimately be provided into societal needs and wants, such as housing, mobility, or nutrition. And then after they have been consumed, they will usually end up as waste, which we can see here at the bottom, or as emissions or additions to stocks, so things that last longer, such as buildings. And then if we take the impact that we've chosen to be the key focus for our circular economy initiative, then we can try tracing how that relates to these material and energy flows. For example, if we have chosen climate change to be the primary impact goal that we want to tackle, then we can really look, okay, how does the extraction of fossil resources and the use thereof relate to emissions that are being created? And also, how does the extraction, for example, change ecosystems and land use, and therefore also causes different emissions? So what we can see here in this visual is an example from our work on a business level, because you can also apply this methodology at a business level, where you try to trace exactly how resources that flow through a business value chain are extracted, turned into products and materials, and then ultimately end up as waste that is treated in different ways. And some of it can become a resource again. So this is an example from our work with a manufacturer of stone wool insulation materials. So rock wool is what they're called. But these are ways of how we can start modeling these material and energy flows, and ultimately understand better how our impact connects to the circular economy. And of course, what we need for that is data. We need data on the extraction of materials, such as mining data, forestry, farming, water use. We need data on production and processing of these materials. We need data on their consumption and use. So what is consumed, where is it consumed, how is it consumed, and especially also how long do products last? And then lastly, we have to know what happens to waste at the end of life. So, and that's where it's really important to also have good data, to also then understand how waste is maybe reused already. And above all, also energy use data is very relevant to see if energy use is connected to materials such as fossil resources, or if it is independent of materials. Collecting this data, if you go to the next slide, thank you, is however not always easy, and a lot of this data is missing. So extraction data, for example, is currently still often very unreliable because it's not structurally collected yet in many places of the world. If you look at a business, they don't always collect the internal data on material use, but rather because it's not yet a key performance indicator that is tracked by a lot of businesses. The consumption and use data, of course, depends very much on the individual consumer or the business using products, and how that affects the product life cycle. And most importantly, we currently don't collect enough data about waste, because oftentimes waste is still not valued as a resource that could be reused, and therefore we don't have clear accounts of what waste arises where and could be available to what kind of uses. And then lastly, oh no, if you could go back to the slide before, we also then don't have any better idea of what waste could be used in use flows. So what we really need is a lot of improved collaboration between companies, between governments, to share this kind of data more openly, and also align some of these diverse material classifications and waste classifications to really be able also to leverage each other's data. With that, I'm handing over to Mariana, who's going to show us a bit how we can use this data.
So the material data challenges that Casper spoke about are also applicable at the city level and at the national level, because every country also collects data in a different way. And within the country, even every municipality collects the data in a different way. So I'm referring here to, for instance, waste data, which in some cases is collected and managed by the municipality, but in other cases might be collected and managed by various actors in the private sector. So it can all be quite overwhelming to try and get an overview of what's happening in your company or in your city. But something that we can do is just try simplify it and keep it simple. And if we want to get a high level overview of what's possible to do, we can also look at just some key indicators related to what we've spoken about before. So for instance, looking at emissions or jobs or gross value added at a sector level, and using that to inform what could be a priority focus area. And what you can see here on the screen is a tool that we've made for city change makers to help them identify which opportunities are relevant to them in their city based on what their focus area is. And their focus area consists of which impacts they're working towards, such as how we spoke about before, and which sector they're working in, and those are the things you see on the screen, and which materials they have a focus on. So using these three high-level indicators at a city level, we're able to study and get to a point where we can just say, okay, let's focus on one of these sectors. So if you go to the next slide. Yes, so now we've maybe selected one of our sectors and one of our focus areas, and we need to link it back to the strategies that Kinga mentioned before. And these strategies that you see here are quite abstract, and they're able to be applied at the national level, at the city level, or at the business level. And if you think about them in different ways, they have a lot of different meaning for each sector. So if we go to the next slide. Over here, what you see is those elements have been worked out in quite a bit more detail, and they have specific strategies that relate to, in this case, the construction sector. And here we have design for the future as one of the elements, as a bit of a zoom in. And we have some of these strategies that come out of the 7 key elements, for instance, design for recycling. So if you think about how many strategies there really are towards a circular economy, these strategies become more relevant depending on what your impact area is. So if you want to do something that's much more future oriented, that has a kind of longer term impact or take longer time to be realized, then the design strategies are better for that, because they kind of start at the beginning of the chain and then only get realized later. Whereas if you want to handle something that's closer to the end of life, then you would look at use waste as a resource strategies. And those include something like open loop upcycling, where you take the waste and you handle it. And in the context of construction, that would be handling demolition waste. I would love to go and give you a bit of a demo of this tool in relation to some cities in Colombia, but maybe in the interest of time, I'll just drop you over a link, and you can feel free to explore different cities and different focus areas, and then see how the different prioritization gets set according to which impact area and which sector you have selected.
Perfect. Thanks, Mariana. And yeah, it would be great if you could share that link with the group so they can check it out after the workshop. Now I wanted to briefly talk about step 3, which is how can we then use the data that we have collected and calculate metrics, ultimately set targets, and prioritize what type of action to take in the circular economy. And if we go to the next slide. I wanted to share a brief example of how we already have been doing some of these measurement exercises on a global level, but also at a national level in our work at Circular Economy, where we have measured, tried to put a number of to circularity on a national and global level. What this percentage describes, in this case, it is really focuses on all the materials that go into an economy. So also, if you think of that diagram we saw before, all the materials on the left-hand side of that diagram going in, and what the share of secondary materials or cycled materials is out of this. And on a global level, that is currently 8.6 or 9% roughly. And then here's a few more countries that we've analyzed this for. Unfortunately, not yet for Colombia, but I'm also sharing a link on some of the research and also the methodology of how we have done this in the chat for people to look at after. Most importantly though, once we have this measurement framework in place, we can also start setting targets because we know what we are working towards. And some examples of these targets include, for example, the national targets of the Netherlands. The Netherlands have pledged to become 100% circular by 2050 and 50% circular already by 2030. Interestingly enough, the Netherlands didn't have an exact measurement framework when they defined the scope at this goal, but are actually have been working quite hard on developing this measurement framework and now have also really come a long way in measuring that. On a business level, we see also big companies pledging towards the circular economy. Here we see two technology companies, with Cisco pledging to achieve 100% product returns to ensure that the materials can be reused, and Dell mentioning that by 2030, they will reuse or recycle an equivalent product for every new product that is bought. But also cities can set these types of targets. So this example here shows the example of the Finnish city, Riihimäki, which engaged in a really collaborative process also with its citizens to define these targets. And once we have this data model in place, if you go to the next place, what we can also do is we can look very detailed at different interventions of the circular economy. So we can look, for example, here, if we take a new approach to deconstructing a maybe modular building that is then really easy to separate and reuse the material of, what kind of benefits can that actually have in terms of generating additional value, generating jobs, or of course, from a circular economy perspective, saving materials and impact reducing CO2 emissions. If you go to the next slide. Oh, sorry, can you go back one? Yes. So these, to do so, we of course also need data. And I think Mariana, you wanted to take over again, right?
Yes.
Can we quickly we have one question coming in from Andres Beles. Andres, do you quickly want to ask your question?
Yep. My question is about, so measuring the gap, it's very related to data, how much data we have, right? And who do you guys know, what company or what country is measuring the most, and what tool do they use?
Yeah. Well, it's quite interesting because there's no, if you look at the SDGs, okay, if we go back to that, there's no specific indicator that relates to something like the circularity gap. I think the one that they have is material consumption per capita. Then if you look at across Europe, they have a statistical office which tries to capture statistics about countries in terms of sustainability, but also because there's so much policy focus and on the circular economy, they have a module of circular economy indicators as well. And there they've started to capture recovery rates per material and so like different various circular economy innovation metrics and research metrics. I can direct you to have a look there as well. As far as I know, there aren't other countries that have really implemented circular economy monitoring at a national level. Outside of that, I'd love to see examples if there are some. But we calculate this circularity gap for countries around the world. But more than the gap, and I think Casper can actually talk to this more, there are a few indicators that can help you understand circularity within the country. Not only the gap, that's just the headline indicator, but there's also a lot of sector deep dives where you have to go and understand what that gap number means for every sector and what you can interpret from it. And I don't know, Casper, if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I can quickly add in that it really is about creating this entire model, and maybe best to describe it with this visualization that we had before of showing how materials really flowed through the economy from extraction to their final use. And then if you look at that diagram, there's a lot of more metrics to be collected from that. Oh yeah, thank you for quickly bringing it up again.
Yeah, there you go.
That's this one. So there you can look at different at metrics specifically for material categories, but also, of course, for the societal needs and the different waste or end of life categories. Something like stock building, so materials that are built up in products that last much longer and are not immediately becoming waste, is also really important as a dynamic to consider how a country or an economic system evolves in building up materials that stay as stock for a longer time. So really there's a lot of detail to be captured. So there's a lot of interest in, of course, then developing also as much as possible this model. And in our record group, we were already talking about that. So using economy-wide or system-specific material flow accounting or analysis, and then also connecting the dots with statistical data available, for example, through what is called input-output tables. Before it gets too technical, I hope this answered roughly the question already, but really worth also looking into the resources, for example, of the European Union on this.
Okay, so we were talking about scenario modeling and the challenges to setting the targets based on these models. So once you've chosen which strategies you want to implement and you want to model the scenarios around them, there are a couple of data gaps that can make this be a bit challenging. So for instance, we have to make some assumptions about how the strategies will affect the headline indicator. So for instance, in this case of deconstructing buildings, if we're studying to what extent will reusing building parts be able to contribute to our circularity gap, we have to make an assumption about the proportion of building parts that will be able to be reused across the industry. And that's very dependent on the uptake in the market and can really change, where your headline indicators go. So that just goes with the modeling. And because we don't have very much information about these kinds of strategies, we typically would have to conduct a survey or do some bespoke research, which can also be very costly and time consuming, as you need to go and do a whole nother study in the field for 3 to 6 months before you can even get to your scenario model. And then even with these models, then there's still going to be data gaps, potentially about like how many windows does every building have? We don't know. So we have to make estimates about that too. And I think lastly, but actually much more importantly, when we look at scenario models, we typically model strategies in isolation. So we say all else equal, what will be the effect of disassembling buildings in the economy? And we ignore the systemic effects of what will happen from that. So it's very difficult to model, what will be the increase or the decrease in the number of jobs in related sectors, or will we start to have to export various parts? And then what will that mean for our local producers who are currently exporting different parts? So always challenges with data. So some solutions, although not specifically to that. It's not like there's no data. There's definitely something. It's just that it all sits in isolation. It all sits in silos, and we don't know how to combine it into one kind of combined or comprehensive overview that can answer our questions. And there are a couple of interesting examples that are emerging in terms of public-private data collaborations that can start to open up data that's typically held within the private sector or across different actors and create an overview of something, a thematic area for sustainability, for answering sustainability questions. And one example is a circularity dataset initiative that was launched in Luxembourg, where different companies across different supply chains are contributing or figuring out the legal terms to contribute data into one repository, which can then start to inform these scenario models that policymakers use to set new policies. Another interesting example is, it's actually not on here, but well, I'll just say, okay, let's do Open Data Policy Lab. And they're working on the legal terms as well to try and break open data sets for use in the public domain for public sector decision making. And I think there are a couple of very interesting examples that came out of South America and even Colombia. And one organization called Data Pop Alliance is using mobile data to do all sorts of interesting things. So, and there's some more links to look forward to. And just one last thing on this slide is that we've been talking a lot about data, about the numbers. How do we share the numbers? But that's not the only kind of data that we need to share to model these solutions. It's also very handy and can be very useful to share stories or knowledge, written case studies. And to that, I would like to point you to our own Circular Economy Knowledge Hub, which is the largest repository of circular case studies. We have about 2,000 examples of case studies and policy instruments and some research articles about circular economy around the world. And we're launching a new version in January, which enables community curation. So we're really excited about it, and I'll drop you the link, and I hope that you visit it and find something inspirational. Now, we're going to go back to the Miro, or are we?
Well, we've had a little bit of a discussion because we've had the technical issues and we've had quite a big delay due to that. So we want to first finish the content to make sure that you get all the insights and then see whether we have time for either a Q&A or have time to do the exercises. But in this way, we can make sure that we cover all the content. And the exercise will also be able to send that to you, even though we haven't finished it. So you can also have a look at that on your own with your colleagues or someplace else. So yeah, apologies that we cannot do everything, but let's have a look at the content first and then see how much time we have left.
Sounds good. Thanks, Phoebe. And with that, then we will jump forward to step 4, which is then the last one. Once you've established the data model and you've set priorities and you've ideally even put a strategy in place on which opportunities are most relevant, have set targets, how can you monitor progress and grow the transparency on your circular economy trajectory? And there's 2 key aspects to that. There's, of course, the internal monitoring to ensure that really progress is made all the time, also always connecting things back to the impact goals that are at the start of the whole circular economy journey, but also to benchmark performance with, say, for example, on a national level, other countries, or at a business level, other companies. The other part is, as circular economy grows in relevance, there's also a lot of interest to have reports on this externally and update different stakeholders of your government, your business, and communicate about that. And for that, it's interesting to see that there's also quite a bit of movement ongoing. If you go to the next slide, on the more externally focused, I think that's still very much in its infancy, but we have several standards of sustainability or key methods of sustainability accounting, which is also often contains aspects on material flow accounting or material accounting, as well as increased reporting. For example, the Global Reporting Initiative that has in this year launched a new standard on how to report on waste creation, but in fact also the use of materials and energy much more detailed, ultimately also enabling to calculate circularity metrics. If you go to the next slide, specifically in the field of circularity metrics, and what's important is this is really more for internal monitoring, because these metrics are quite new, they're only just being developed, and they are not completely ready to be compared across different companies, but or countries. But what you can do is you can already, as an entity, do your analysis and then compare and benchmark with previous results, so you can track your progress over time. And there's a few frameworks that I'm happy to share with you guys that can be kind of also classified as to how they become relevant through different stages of the circular economy kind of innovation trajectory, from creating awareness to identifying and tracking opportunities to assessing and comparing the potential and build business cases to really reporting. And that's where you see the GRI standard coming up again. There's certifications such as the cradle to cradle certification already out there, but then also measurement frameworks such as the CTI tool, which has been developed by the World Business Council for sustainable development.
Casper, can you go slower a little bit?
Absolutely, apologies, I just saw. So maybe I'm gonna reiterate a few points a bit slower now. For internal progress monitoring and also benchmarking with previous results, it is really important to have these new tools come up that specifically measure material use and put a number to circularity. In this diagram, we can see how those kind of can be clustered across different stages in the innovation trajectory. So from creating awareness to identifying and tracking opportunities, to assessing and comparing potential and building business cases, to even then monitor and report. And that's where the GRI, so Global Reporting Initiative standard that we've already discussed on the previous slide, appears again, but also some other tools that I would like to highlight. One is the circularity gap metric that Circular Economy publishes itself, especially on a national and global level, more and more so also on a business level. However, that is not always publicly available, the results of those measurements, of course. Another tool that has just come out in this year is the CTI tool, so Circular Transition Indicators by the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, that also provides a measurement framework for circularity for businesses. The methodology behind it is also available online for free, so should be really interesting to check out. We will make sure to also include a link to that. Some other ones include Circulytics, for example, from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, or the Circaligence framework, which is more executed by a designated partner, which is the Boston Consulting Group. With these, you can then ultimately develop your own metrics dashboard to then see also which metrics are most relevant to your subject. So for example, where you can have a headline indicator such as the circularity gap metric, but then also track things like material footprint, the share of cycled materials that go into your business, or also the end of life cycling of resources when they become waste. So much for that now on measuring circularity more on a business level also. I think Mariana has one more message on connecting data to decision making.
Yes. So what's quite interesting is that data gets used at the beginning of the innovation process to design a strategy, to see what's going on, and to get a kind of high level, where should we go, which direction should we go. But once we've set the direction and we've decided on the standards and we've decided what we're doing and what we want to do, then we need much more dynamic data where we monitor progress on an ongoing basis. And increasingly with the use of, let's say, big data or like generally IT infrastructure, it's easier to set up this ongoing monitoring and continuously updating the data for the material flow model or for our impact assessment, and making sure that we're progressing in the right direction. But unfortunately, we're not really used to using data for decision making. And across the public sector and the private sector, it's been notoriously difficult. I think like 20% of companies have been able to incorporate data into actual decision makers at a senior level. And usually what happens is that dashboards get created and complicated reporting structures get set up, but they aren't used to make decisions. So it's very important to set up the pipeline and starting with the decision makers to encourage them, or not encourage them, but somehow to ensure that the people who need to make the influential decisions are connected to the data, rather than starting from the perspective of trying to get as much data as you can about everything you can think of, and then trying to get the decision maker to look at it. An interesting example is something like this Global Fishing Watch, which you may already know about, but it's a really cool website, which shows the position of all the vessels in pretty much real time and all the fishing that's being done. But unfortunately, it's very difficult to actually do anything about anything when you see this data dashboard. If we see that if there's overfishing in a region, the decision makers or people who are enabled to do something about that are not really looking at this dashboard. So we need to bridge that gap. And I think another thing that's quite interesting is in the creation of these data sets for decision making. And we already mentioned this before as well, that the data sits across different actors. So in the event that we want to monitor the access to, for instance, clean water of different people, different water suppliers and different members of the value chain are going to have different pieces of the puzzle, which they need to combine into one data set, but are currently unable to do so because maybe they don't know how. It's technically very difficult and kind of expensive. And also there are hurdles about privacy and data sharing, which means that these companies can't necessarily share data points. But increasingly, there are examples of these public-private data collaborations where private parties are able to aggregate data in a way that doesn't compromise privacy. And they do this by providing a much higher level of data rather than the granular data, and then combine it into one pool. You may be familiar with the Know Your Customer concept in banking, where banks are starting to share data to prevent money laundering and etc. Well, there's a similar concept emerging with Know Your Supplier, which will be very supportive of the circular economy movement, in which supply chains are starting to share high-level aggregate data points. And if we can use that momentum, which is currently mostly about economic data, and also track a little bit of material data, then we might be able to turn all of our local efforts about circular economy and track them at a global level and really move this forward into some kind of sustainable, into what? Sustainable planet, sustainable economy. So I think that's where we're at today, that data is important, but it's only important if it's used correctly and that the right questions are asked. And with that, I think we would like to open up actually to questions to you, and hear what you think, or anything that you have about, any questions that you have about what we've discussed today. Maybe back to Kinga at this point.
Yeah, I can take the questions on. So for all of you, there are two ways to ask questions now. One is via the chat box, or you can unmute yourself and then ask it yourself. So are there any questions?
Yeah, it's me again.
Go for it.
And it's about the same thing, because I think it's very important that we start collaborating and sharing information, of course. And what of the big players, or which of the big players in big data are already interested in working on a solution towards the sharing of this, and also the processing, because data we have a lot of data, so processing the data and making it very making it useful, is one of the key things, right? And my question is, what, like, specific moves and can we look up, like, like, I don't know, I've heard about circularize or circulytics or plataforma verde in Brazil. Any other?
Yeah, so it also depends a little bit on sorry the different industries and supply chains are collaborating in different ways. Like, I think there's an example called Text Trace, and they're working with textiles companies to track materials and put actually RFID into the clothes. So it's interesting to think about things that already have the data. So you already have the data, and it's a matter of unlocking it. So we already know what's going into the port. Somebody knows. So all they have to do is tell someone else, which is a different problem to textiles tracking, where we actually don't know because clothing isn't identifiable. So they need to now invent like RFID or something to help you track the clothes.
Traceability, right?
Yeah, exactly. So those are two different problems, and I think they're being dealt with in different ways. Other examples of data sharing in the circular economy. Let me see.
Even in the linear economy, because our ability to change this linear economy towards a circular one, it depends on the sharing of the information. So yeah, traceability in any circumstance.
Well, maybe
you guys know Circularize? I think it's from Holland.
Yeah, they're in Delft.
yeah.
I mean, there are a few. There's
They're doing good?
I think they've done quite a bit of work with batteries. So I'm thinking that there's also, it's also dependent on which products have alliances. So where has the value chain managed to rally together an alliance? So batteries is one, where they've developed protocols around what goes into a battery. And then consequently, that makes batteries, you can understand what's in them. So you can take the components apart and then you can sell them again. So Circularize was involved a little bit with that. And there was another one that now I can't remember the name.
You have provenance. So it's a blockchain technology. They use blockchain to source materials down to the raw materials. So for example, wool, they source them down to the sheep. They use it with coffee as well. And the aim with provenance is really to make the value chain transparent, so that when the customer in the shop buys her sweater or buys his coffee, that customer via Provenance app, the platform, can see where it comes from, and how what the stages were in the value chain.
Yes. And there's also other interesting solutions which don't link to the product itself. For instance, there's a company which links to your, in order to verify secondhand products, they link your online wallet to products that you've bought online to verify where you got it, so that now you can have as your own portfolio trace the product as you then sell it on to the next party. And I'm just getting some other examples to drop in the chat. So here's text trace. The other problem with traceability is that it really requires that the product has sufficient margin to warrant all of this extra, administration around capturing it. So I dropped an example there called Everledger, where they have done this like blockchain solution, but really only for quite expensive products, because you're not going to go and track and trace a pair. It's way too expensive.
All right. Are there any other questions, promptings? Because this is the moment to ask. Nicolás.
Hola. Bueno, voy a hacer la pregunta en español and then I translate it to English, okay?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Todos los productos que compramos tienen un código de barras porque, pues, digamos, es la manera como nos facturan. Casi todos los productos. No debería existir, o ya existe, alguna manera de generar esa trazabilidad a través del mismo código de barras de los productos. The question is, have you seen any initiative or project that comes out on the QR code of each product? Because each product we buy, we have like the QR product that have the pricing on it. Shouldn't that same QR code have all the information to make the traceability of the product? Obviously, it's gonna have the data on the consumption of it, not of its second life cycle or where does it go after it is disposed. But that data, it's being collected by the supermarkets and by any producer that is selling goods. So what about that QR code?
Yeah, for sure. There's an interesting example with this IBM solution that I just dropped in there called the Food Trust, where they tried to say, okay, let's get like using those QR codes that you mentioned in the barcodes, can we trace food? I think mostly in America. And the way that it started was that the manager came to the team and said, like, here's a packet of mango. Like, here's the mango, here it's from like this supermarket. Here's the QR code. Now trace it back to the farm. Go. Like, let's see how long it takes you to figure out where this packet of mango came from. And then they just had to like phone the different suppliers and like try and figure out like which supermarket did it come from, and then which wholesaler did it come from, but all manual, and just using the code over there. And it took them, well, you can guess. How long do you think it took them?
1 day?
No. Took them like
months?
2 weeks. I think it took a team of 8 full-time days to find it. And that's what started the Food Trust's project, where they're trying to do that. But there are a lot of challenges because of all the different wholesalers along the value chain who have to now figure out and use the same codes. And they all already have systems. And some of them don't even necessarily have systems. So they need to get a system going, which is expensive for them. And farmers don't necessarily have resources to build that infrastructure. And further, they don't actually want necessarily people to know what their yield is per square meter, because that might affect them negatively more than positively with people tracing and regulating exactly what's happening on every square inch of their farm. And culturally, you know, I don't know, not necessarily, farmers aren't necessarily interested in innovating. This is a great generalization. But one could say that if you're living the slow life in the countryside, you aren't necessarily interested in like that kind of extreme digitalization and tapping in, but it all depends.
All right, thanks, Mariana. Are there any other questions from the group about the ground that we've covered today? I see a lot of thinking faces.
When are you guys thinking of including Colombia into this report?
Casper, that's one for you.
I would like to start tomorrow.
Unfortunately,
can you? Well, there's a few things that play into it. One is, of course, that we need to have the relevant partnerships in place with local stakeholders. So already I was super happy to meet Luz today, who is from the Ministry of Environment, actually, or Carlos, who is working at the National Statistics Department. Would be really interested to pick up the discussion with them and then see what data is currently available and how we can support with creating such an analysis for Colombia. And yeah, I think that's about where we're at currently, but really would be very excited to explore this further. Maybe one more word of why we maybe have been so focused on countries in Europe so far is also relating to the existing data quality, the momentum that is currently there for the topic in Europe, and also with that a lot of resources being poured into research on the topic. And hearing that there is such an interest from a country like Colombia is really exciting for us, and I think also quite important to advance the debate on the circular economy as we go into different continents, different economies that maybe are set up very differently, and to really understand also what are the intricacies of these material flows then, and how do those affect the circular economy and its circularity.
Right.
I have a question.
Okay, yeah, go for it.
How useful are open data policies for the measurement of circular economy initiatives or goals? I mean, in Colombia, we have an open data policy, and it's like better than in other Latin America countries, but I don't know if this is like a direct measure of how can we improve measurement of circular economy.
Mariana or Casper, who's going to take it?
Well, I have a comment, and maybe Casper can also have a comment. I don't know.
Yeah.
But so the countries are developing sustainability strategies, and countries are also developing digital strategies, but they aren't necessarily doing that together or in a coordinated way. And that's true for countries and cities and businesses. If the IT department is pioneering something unrelated to what the sustainability department is pioneering. So at the same time, circular economy decision makers consistently cite the need for more data. So we're trying to bridge the gap between circular and sustainable strategies and digital strategies. So if you're building an open data infrastructure anyway, you're not, it doesn't, like the content, you may as well do it for the sustainability strategy. In Europe, there's 3 or 4 major policy documents about circular economy that talk about the need for digital. And then there's 3 or 4 policy documents that talk about, you know, a digital society for like sustainable development, but there's no policy documents that talk about the integration of those two worlds. So it depends is my answer. Like, it's helpful, but only if you redirect the work into existing sustainability targets. There's no point in having big data if you don't have the goal to be sustainable and to be sustainable through the use of big data.
Yeah, I think maybe adding to that, I think what will be a really useful application of big data is to collect additional data that is currently not being collected and would be really important in supporting the sustainable or circular transition. So the example I made earlier is data on waste creation, waste treatment, and ultimately waste reuse. Currently, once something is classified as waste and therefore classified as without value, it is not recorded anywhere. So there's the point of facilitating the digitalization and connecting that with sustainability, but there's really also the point of expanding the scope of what data we currently collect and record.
So I have a question. You were talking about that it's really hard to collect data, right? And that we need to simplify and prioritize the way we do it in order to select one of this. This is my question. I don't know how can I prioritize the selection of one of those 7 key elements if I'm a business, for example, and then how do I know where to put all my efforts and which data should I collect to make this happen? Do you understand?
Yeah, I think I'm not sure if I understand you correctly, but it kind of comes back to this gradual process of identifying what is the main impact you want to achieve and how does this impact connect to the different flows of material and energy. And I think if, for example, then you decide that this impact is, again, putting as an example, carbon emissions, or maybe also just the responsible use of materials and reduction of waste, that is just as much an impact goal. How can you trace material flows and identify where the key sources of leakage or waste creation are? So there's first of all that prioritization effort that effort to get an insight into what your material flows currently look like. And that can be qualitative by just mapping how do materials flow without saying exactly the amounts of materials, but really just understanding the directions and what are the different stages and processes that materials flow through, getting that oversight, and then already maybe qualitatively judging which ones are the biggest flows, the most relevant flows, where's the most waste created, which material flows relate a lot to, for example, emissions or energy use, and how that can then be translated back to the strategies that we applied. So could this current material flow be replaced by secondary resources, or could it be replaced even by regenerative, renewable, bio-based materials? And how can also that material that currently is required to satisfy societal need, how can we find a solution to use less material to satisfy that societal need and want? So I think it's this gradual prioritization that requires gathering a first overview, and then as you gain more data, starting to put more flesh to the bone of these qualitative flows in a way, and then connecting that back to your impact goals.
All right, I think with that answer, we've reached the end of today's workshop. If you have any questions, anything you'd like us to ask us, you can find us via our email addresses or find us online, but we'll be happy to continue the conversation and to continue talking if there is anything, yeah, so feel free to reach out to us. Thanks a lot for being with us today. Although we have been railing off our schedule a little bit, we will definitely send you all the content. So the presentations, we'll forward you the links, and also the exercises that we have done today. So even though we might not have gone through them now, you will be able to have a look at them, and hopefully they will guide you to some answers. So I would say that's it from my side. And Isabel is going to say the last few final words.
Gracias, King. De nuevo, pues agradecerles a todos por la participación el día de hoy. Para nosotros fue un gusto contar con este primer espacio y que no será el último definitivamente en conversaciones con Circular Economy y con otras entidades que tengan relación con la implementación y la transición a la economía circular. Desde el Lab van a seguir realizándose eventos de este tipo para que estén pendientes, los tendremos a todos en cuenta para continuar enviándoles información de lo que nosotros estamos realizando con esta transición a la circularidad y con la implementación. Y nada, pues disculparlos de nuevo por los problemas técnicos, siempre suceden en este tipo de eventos. Espero que para todos haya sido de mucha utilidad la información que se compartió el día de hoy. Si tienen algunas preguntas, observaciones, también nos las pueden hacer llegar y nosotros hablamos directamente con el equipo de Circular para lo que necesiten. Y de nuevo, muchas gracias por el tiempo que hoy nos dedicaron. Sí, nosotros a los correos estaremos enviando toda la información, incluyendo la grabación del día de hoy, más la presentación y los links que se requieran compartir. Igual también les enviaremos una breve encuesta preguntándoles la utilidad que fue para ustedes este taller y cómo les pareció la información. Y de nuevo, muchas gracias.